This first grammar video is about expository essay conventions. Now, hopefully this is a review for most of you, but at least you'll have your notes template so that you can follow along and make sure that you get the notes that you need. First to remember is that book and play titles are always underlined or italicized. So The Daughter of Time, The Lord of Flies, Richard III, The Crucible. You choose whether you'd like to underline or italicize it, and typically if you're going to be typing, you're going to be using italics instead of underline. Next, article, short story, and poem titles are always put in quotation marks. So we have our story 2-in-1, the poem Sonnet 18, or the short story Gift of the Magi. Now Beowulf is different because it is considered an epic poem, and because they are long works, or they are longer than a normal poem, epic poems are italicized or underlined just like a book or a play. Next, always talk about literature with present tense verbs. So instead of Grant investigated the story of Richard III, we're going to change it to Grant investigates so that we have the present tense. So notice we still have the present tense here, but that I left killed in past tense, supposedly killed his nephews. That's because this happens outside the story or outside the novel. It's not something that we see. It's something that happened before the beginning of the novel, so that will stay in past tense. Everything that happens in the novel stays in present tense. In English class, and hopefully in your other classes, we're going to be using MLA format. So if your essay is only about one text, you've already named the author, then your citation does not need to repeat the author's name. All you're going to need is the page number in the parentheses. So you'll have your quotation, your closing quotation marks, the number in your parentheses, and the period afterwards. And that's a really hard and fast rule for us. So number 2, if the author ends your quotation in a period, there is no punctuation before the closing quotation mark. So the period that would have been here, instead of having that, I'm going to erase it. And then I'm going to draw an arrow to show that it goes all the way at the end of my parentheses or the end of my sentence. Differently though, number 3, if the author ends your quotation in a question mark or an exclamation point, you leave this before the closing quotation mark. So notice if my quotation ended with this question, I leave the question mark, then my closing quotes, then my parentheses and my page number, and look, I have to repeat an ending punctuation number at the end, so I have to put my period at the end. Same thing here. My quote, my exclamation point, my closing quotation mark, closing parentheses, and then my period at the very end. One rule that I like to follow is that citations always go at the end of your sentence, no matter where the quotation is located. So let's say you have the first part of your sentence, then the quotation, and then the second part of the sentence. I wouldn't cite page 33 until the very end of my sentence. Notice also I've left off the period here, and instead I've put it at the very end of my sentence. The last thing to review in this video is integrating quotation. So we have 3 strategies that we use, so be sure these go on your notes template. Strategy 1 is to use an introductory phrase and a comma. I like to say that introductory phrases end with a, quote, speaking verb. So it might be like, the person says, the character said, the character thinks, the character asks. Something that needs to be completed with what the character actually said or believes or ponders. For instance, you could have something like, Grant asks, comma, it's odd, isn't it, blah, blah, blah. Notice that my period goes at the very end of my sentence. Number 2, when discussing Richard III's supposed villainy, the surgeon says, comma, I suppose, blah, blah, blah. Finish it with period. According to the surgeon, comma, villainy, like beauty, is in the eye of the beholder, period. So notice this one doesn't necessarily have a speaking verb, but it's still the same idea. We've introduced the speaker. We have introduced a little bit about what they say, right? This is according to the surgeon. And then we have to say what is according to the surgeon. Strategy 2 is to use a complete sentence indicating what the reader is about to find out in the quote, and a colon. Those are the 2 dots. So look here. The surgeon speculates that villainy is a matter of one's perspective. I could easily put a period there and have the perfect sentence. But instead, I've decided that I'm going to leave a quote to prove my idea. So I include a colon, and then I have my quote that proves exactly what I said before the colon. Notice I still end with my period at the end. Here's another example of that. Grant remembers the mystery about Richard III. Could easily put a period there, move on, but instead I have decided I'm going to give a quote to prove it, a quote to show that I'm not just making this up. So then I have my whole quote, I end with my period, and notice that everything in white explains or repeats everything that's in blue. Strategy 3, last one. Make the quotation part of your own sentence grammatically. There's no punctuation except the quotation marks that separate your words from the author's words. So look at this example. Richard III was a hunchback who usurped the throne on his brother's death in place of the boy heir, period. I could easily say that to you and you would have no idea that I was quoting the book. But when I'm writing, I want to show that I am quoting the book and that I'm not just making all this up. I actually have evidence from the text to prove it. So even though these words blend together really well, we still need to have the quotation marks to show that you're getting this information from the text. But notice I have no other punctuation before or after the quote. Here's one more example of that. In looking at the photo of Richard III, the surgeon sees, quote, the look one sees on the face of a crippled child. And later, after discovering it is in fact Richard III, supposedly, quote, the most dazzling exhibition of sheer evil, quote, the surgeon decides that villainy is in the eye of the beholder. So notice that I have totally blended all of the quotes with my own words. The only time I've ever used commas or the only time I've ever used punctuation marks to separate my quote from my own words is if the sentence needed it anyways. So we'll talk later about how this is an independent clause and this is an independent clause, and thus I needed this comma right here. And same thing here, we could cross off all of this. This is called an appositive, and so then we need this comma here. So if you're following normal grammar rules and you need punctuation, that's okay for strategy 3, integrating your quotes. So that's all I have for you in this first grammar video. Be sure you finish up that notes template. If you have any questions, please feel free to send me an email so that I can be sure to either respond to you or answer the whole question for the class.